Semiology and Grammatology interview with Julia Kristeva. Semiology today is constructed on the model of the sign and its correlates, communication and structure. What are the logocentric and ethnocentric limits of these models, and how are they incapable of serving as the basis for a notation attempting to escape metaphysics? Derrida, all gestures here are necessarily equivocal. And supposing, which I do not believe, that someday it will be possible simply to escape metaphysics, the concept of the sign will have marked, in this sense, a simultaneous impediment and progress. For if the sign, by its root and its implications, is in all its aspects metaphysical, if it is in systematic solidarity with Stoic and medieval theology, the work and the displacement to which it has been submitted and of which it also, curiously, is the instrument have had delimiting effects. For this work and displacement have permitted the critique of how the concept of the sign belongs to metaphysics, which represents a simultaneous marking and loosening of the limits of the system in which this concept was born and began to serve, and thereby also represents, to a certain extent, an uprooting of the sign from its own soil. This work must be conducted as far as possible, but at a certain point one inevitably encounters the logocentric and ethnocentric limits of such a model. At this point, perhaps, the concept is to be abandoned. But this point is very difficult to determine, and is never pure. All the heuristic and critical resources of the concept of the sign have to be exhausted, and exhausted equally in all domains and contexts. Now, it is inevitable that not only inequalities of development, which will always occur, but also the necessity of certain contexts, will render strategically indispensable the recourse to a model known elsewhere, and even at the most novel points of investigation, to function as an obstacle. To take only one example, one could show that a semiology of the Saussurean type has had a double role. On the one hand, an absolutely decisive critical role, one it has marked, against the tradition, that the signified is inseparable from the signifier, that the signified and signifier are the two sides of one and the same production. Saussure even purposely refused to have this opposition or this two-sided unity conform to the relationship between soul and body, as had always been done. This two-sided unity has often been compared to the unity of the human person, composed of a body and a soul. The comparison is hardly satisfactory. Cause de linguistique générale, E 145, 2. By emphasizing the differential and formal characteristics of semiological functioning, by showing that it is impossible for sound, the material element, itself to belong to language and that in its essence it, the linguistic signifier, is not at all phonic, P 164, by disubstantializing both the signified content and the expressive substance which therefore is no longer in a privileged or exclusive way phonic by making linguistics a division of general semiology, P 33, Saussure. Powerfully contributed to turning against the metaphysical tradition the concept of the sign that he borrowed from it. And yet Saussure could not confirm this tradition in the extent to which he continued to use the concept of the sign. No more than any other, this concept cannot be employed in both an absolutely novel and an absolutely conventional way. One necessarily assumes, in a non-critical way, at least some of the implications inscribed in its system. There is at least one moment at which Saussure must renounce drawing all the conclusions from the critical work he has undertaken, and that is the not fortuitous moment when he resigns himself to using the word sign lacking anything better. After having justified the introduction of the words signified and signifier, Saussure writes, as for sign, if we retain it, it is because we find nothing else to replace it, everyday language suggesting no other, pp 99-100. And, in effect, it is difficult to see how one could evacuate the sign when one has begun by proposing the opposition signified / signifier. Now, everyday language is not innocent or neutral. It is the language of Western metaphysics, and it carries with it not only a considerable number of presuppositions of all types, but also presuppositions inseparable from metaphysics, which, although little attended to, are knotted into a system. This is why on the other hand, the maintenance of the rigorous distinction and essential and juridical distinction between the signans and the signatum, the equation of the signatum and the concept, p. 99, one inherently leaves open the possibility of thinking a concept signified in and of itself, a concept simply present for thought, independent of a relationship to language, that is of a relationship to a system of signifiers. By leaving open this possibility, and it is inherent even in the opposition signifier / signified, that is in the sign, Saussure contradicts the critical acquisitions of which we were just speaking. He accedes to the classical exigency of what I have proposed to call a transcendental signified which in and of itself, in its essence, would refer to no signifier, would exceed the chain of signs, and would no longer itself function as a signifier. On the contrary, though, from the moment that one questions the possibility of such a transcendental signified, and that one recognizes that every signified is also in the position of a signifier too, the distinction between signified and signifier becomes problematical at its root. Of course this is an operation that must be undertaken with prudence, for a. It must pass through the difficult times deconstruction of the entire history of metaphysics which imposed, and never will cease to impose upon semiological science in its entirety this fundamental quest for a transcendental signified and a concept independent of language, this quest not being imposed from without by something like philosophy but rather by everything that links our language, our culture, our system of thought to the history and system of metaphysics, b. Nor is it a question of confusing at every level, and in all simplicity, the signifier and the signified. That this opposition or difference cannot be radical or absolute does not prevent it from functioning, and even from being indispensable within certain limits, very wide limits. For example, no translation would be possible without it. In effect, the theme of a transcendental signified took shape within the horizon of an absolutely pure, transparent, and unequivocal translatability. In the limits to which it is possible, or at least appears possible, translation practices the difference between signified and signifier. But if this difference is never pure, no more so is translation, and for the notion of translation we would have to substitute a notion of transformation, a regulated transformation of one language by another, of one text by another. We will never have, and in fact have never had, to do with some transport of pure signifieds from one language to another, or within one and the same language, that the signifying instrument would leave virgin and untouched. 2. Although he recognized the necessity of putting the phonic substance between brackets, what is essential in language, we shall see, is foreign to the phonic character of the linguistic sign, O 21. In its essence it, the linguistic signifier, is not at all phonic, O 164, Saussure, for essential, and essentially metaphysical, reasons had to privilege speech, everything that links the sign to phone. He also speaks of the natural link between thought and voice, meaning and sound, p. 46. He even speaks of thought-sound, p. 156. I have attempted elsewhere to show what is traditional in such a gesture, and to what necessities it submits. In any event, it winds up contradicting the most interesting critical motive of the course, making of linguistics the regulatory model, the pattern for a general semiology of which it was to be, by all rights and theoretically, only a part. The theme of the arbitrary, thus, is turned away from its most fruitful paths, formalization, toward a hierarchism teleology. Thus it can be said that entirely arbitrary signs realize better than any others the ideal of the semiological process. This is why language, the most complex and most widespread of the systems of expression, is also the most characteristic one of them all. In this sense linguistics can become the general pattern for all semiology, even though language is only a particular system. P. 101. One finds exactly the same gesture and the same concepts in Hegel. The contradiction between these two moments of the course is also marked by Saussure's recognizing elsewhere that it is not spoken language that is natural to man, but the faculty of constituting a language, that is, a system of distinct signs, that is, the possibility of the code and of articulation, independent of any substance, for example, phonic substance. 3. The concept of the sign, signifier / signified, carries within itself the necessity of privileging the phonic substance and of setting up linguistics as the pattern for semiology. Phone, in effect, is the signifying substance given to consciousness as that which is most intimately tied to the thought of the signified concept. From this point of view, the voice is consciousness itself. When I speak, not only am I conscious of being present for what I think, but I am conscious also of keeping as close as possible to my thought, or to the concept a signifier that does not fall into the world, a signifier that I hear as soon as I emit it, that seems to depend upon my pure and free spontaneity, requiring the use of no instrument, no accessory, no force taken from the world. Not only do the signifier and the signified seem to unite, but also, in this confusion, the signifier seems to erase itself or to become transparent, in order to allow the concept to present itself as what it is, referring to nothing other than its presence. The exteriority of the signifier seems reduced. Naturally this experience is allure, but allure whose necessity has organized an entire structure, or an entire epoch, and on the grounds of this epoch a semiology has been constituted whose concepts and fundamental presuppositions are quite precisely discernible from Plato to Husserl, passing through Aristotle, Rousseau, Hegel, etc. 4. To reduce the exteriority of the signifier is to exclude everything in semiotic practice that is not psychic. Now, only the privilege accorded to the phonetic and linguistic sign can authorize Saussure's proposition according to which the linguistic sign is therefore a two-sided psychic entity, p. 99. Supposing that this proposition has a rigorous sense in and of itself, it is difficult to see how it could be extended to every sign, be it phonetic linguistic or not. It is difficult to see therefore, except, precisely, by making of the phonetic sign the pattern for all signs, how general semiology can be inscribed in a psychology. However, this is what Saussure does. One can thus conceive of a science that would study the life of signs at the heart of social life. It would form a part of social psychology, and consequently of general psychology. We will name it semiology, from the Greek semeion, sign. It would teach what signs consist of, what laws regulate them. Since it does not yet exist, one cannot say what it will be, but it has a right to exist. Its place is determined in advance. Linguistics is only a part of this general science. The laws that semiology will discover will be applicable to linguistics, and the latter will find itself attached to a well-defined domain in the set of human facts. It is for the psychologist to determine the exact place of semiology, p. 33. Of course modern linguists and semioticians have not remained with Saussure, or at least with this Saussurean psychologism. The Copenhagen School and all of American linguistics have explicitly criticized it. But if I have insisted on Saussure, it is not only because even those who criticize him recognize him as the founder of general semiology and borrow most of their concepts from him, but above all because one cannot simply criticize the psychologistic usage of the concept of the sign. Psychologism is not the poor usage of a good concept, but is inscribed and prescribed within the concept of the sign itself, in the equivocal manner of which I spoke at the beginning. This equivocality, which weighs upon the model of the sign, marks the semiological project itself and the organic totality of its concepts, in particular that of communication, which in effect implies a transmission charged with making pass, from one subject to another, the identity of a signified object, of a meaning or of a concept rightfully separable from the process of passage and from the signifying operation. Communication presupposes subjects, whose identity and presence are constituted before the signifying operation, and objects, signified concepts, a thought meaning that the passage of communication will have neither to constitute, nor, by all rights, to transform. A communicates B to C. Through the sign the emitter communicates something to a receptor, etc. The case of the concept of structure, that you also bring up, is certainly more ambiguous. Everything depends upon how one sets it to work. Like the concept of the sign and therefore of semiology, it can simultaneously confirm and shake logocentric and ethnocentric assuredness. It is not a question of junking these concepts, nor do we have the means to do so. Doubtless it is more necessary, from within semiology, to transform concepts, to de-place them, to turn them against their presuppositions, to reinscribe them in other chains, and little by little to modify the terrain of our work and thereby produce new configurations. I do not believe in decisive ruptures, in an unequivocal epistemological break as it is called today. Breaks are always, and fatally, reinscribed in an old cloth that must continually, interminably be undone. This interminability is not an accident or contingency, it is essential, systematic, and theoretical. And this in no way minimizes the necessity and relative importance of certain breaks, of the appearance and definition of new structures. Kristeva, what is the grammar as a new structure of non-presence? What is writing as difference? What rupture do these concepts introduce in relation to the key concepts of semiology, phonetic, sign and structure? How does the notion of text replace, in grammatology, the linguistic and semiological notion of what is enounced? Derrida, the reduction of writing as the reduction of the exteriority of the signifier was part and parcel of phonologism and logocentrism. We know how Saussure, according to the traditional operation that was also Plato's, Aristotle's, Rousseau's, Hegel's, Husserl's, etc., excludes writing from the field of linguistics from language and speech as a phenomenon of exterior representation, both useless and dangerous. The linguistic object is not defined by the combination of the written word and the spoken word, the latter alone constituting this object. P. 45. Writing is foreign to the internal system of language. P. 44. Writing veils our view of language, it does not clothe language, but travesties it. P. 51. The tie of writing to language is superficial factitious. It is bizarre that writing, which should only be an image, usurps the principal role and that the natural relationship is inversed. P. 47. Writing is a trap, its action is vicious and tyrannical, its misdeeds are monstrosities, tautological cases linguistics should put them under observation in a special compartment, p. 54, etc. Naturally, this representativist conception of writing, language and writing are two distinct sign systems. The unique raison d'être of the second is to represent the first. P. 45 is linked to the practice of phonetic alphabetic writing, to which Saussure realizes his study is limited. P. 48. In effect, alphabetical writing seems to present speech, and at the same time to erase itself before speech. Actually, it could be shown, as I have attempted to do, that there is no purely phonetic writing, and that phonologism is less a consequence of the practice of the alphabet in a given culture than a certain ethical or axiological experience of this practice. Writing should erase itself before the plenitude of living speech, perfectly represented in the transparence of its notation, immediately present for the subject who speaks it, and for the subject who receives its meaning, content, value. Now, if one ceases to limit oneself to the model of phonetic writing, which we privilege only by ethnocentrism, and if we draw all the consequences from the fact that there is no purely phonetic writing, by reason of the necessary spacing of signs, punctuation, intervals, the difference is indispensable for the functioning of graphemes, etc., then the entire phonologist or logocentrist logic becomes problematical. Its range of legitimacy becomes narrow and superficial. This delimitation, however, is indispensable if one wants to be able to account, with some coherence, for the principle of difference, such as Saussure himself recalls it. This principle compels us not only not to privilege one substance, here the phonic, so-called temporal, substance, while excluding another, for example, the graphic, so-called spatial, substance, but even to consider every process of signification as a formal play of differences. That is, of traces. Why traces? And by what right do we reintroduce grammatics at the moment when we seem to have neutralized every substance, be it phonic, graphic, or otherwise? Of course it is not a question of resorting to the same concept of writing and of simply inverting the dissymmetry that now has become problematical. It is a question, rather, of producing a new concept of writing. This concept can be called gram or difference. The play of differences supposes, in effect, syntheses and referrals which forbid at any moment, or in any sense, that a simple element be present in and of itself, referring only to itself. Whether in the order of spoken or written discourse, no element can function as a sign without referring to another element which itself is not simply present. This interweaving results in each element phoneme or grapheme being constituted on the basis of the trace within it of the other elements of the chain or system. This interweaving, this textile, is the text produced only in the transformation of another text. Nothing, neither among the elements nor within the system, is anywhere ever simply present or absent. There are only, everywhere, differences and traces of traces. The gram, then, is the most general concept of semiology, which thus becomes grammatology, and it covers not only the field of writing in the restricted sense, but also the field of linguistics. The advantage of this concept provided that it be surrounded by a certain interpretive context, for no more than any other conceptual element it does not signify, or suffice, by itself, is that in principle it neutralizes the phonologistic propensity of the sign and in fact counterbalances it by liberating the entire scientific field of the graphic substance, history and systems of writing beyond the bounds of the West, whose interest is not minimal, but which so far has been left in the shadows of neglect. The grammar's difference, then, is a structure and a movement no longer conceivable on the basis of the opposition presence/absence. Difference is the systematic play of differences, of the traces of differences, of the spacing by means of which elements are related to each other. This spacing is the simultaneously active and passive. The of difference indicates this indecision as concerns activity and passivity, that which cannot be governed by or distributed between the terms of this opposition. 3. Production of the intervals without which the full terms would not signify, would not function. It is also the becoming space of the spoken chain which has been called temporal or linear, a becoming space which makes possible both writing and every correspondence between speech and writing, every passage from one to the other. The activity or productivity connoted by the of difference refers to the generative movement in the play of differences. The latter are neither fallen from the sky nor inscribed once and for all in a closed system, a static structure that a synchronic and taxonomic operation could exhaust. Differences are the effects of transformations, and from this vantage the theme of difference is incompatible with the static, synchronic, taxonomic, historic motifs in the concept of structure. But it goes without saying that this motif is not the only one that defines structure, and that the production of difference is not a structural, it produces systematic and regulated transformations which are able, at a certain point, to leave room for a structural science. The concept of difference even develops the most legitimate principled exigencies of structuralism. Language, and in general every semiotic code which Saussure defines as classifications, are therefore effects, but their cause is not a subject, a substance, or a being somewhere present and outside the movement of difference. Since there is no presence before and outside semiological difference, one can extend to the system of signs in general what Saussure says of language. Language is necessary for speech to be intelligible and to produce all its effects, but speech is necessary for language to be established. Historically, the fact of speech always comes first. There is a circle here, for if one rigorously distinguishes language and speech, code and message, schema and usage, etc., and if one wishes to do justice to the two postulates thus enunciated, one does not know where to begin, nor how something can begin in general, be it language or speech. Therefore, one has to admit, before any dissociation of language and speech, code and message, etc., and everything that goes along with such a dissociation, a systematic production of differences, the production of a system of differences, a difference within whose effects one eventually, by abstraction and according to determined motivations, will be able to demarcate a linguistics of language and a linguistics of speech, etc. Nothing no present and indifferent being thus precedes difference and spacing. There is no subject who is agent, author, and master of difference, who eventually and empirically would be overtaken by difference. Subjectivity like objectivity is an effect of difference, an effect inscribed in a system of difference. This is why the of difference also recalls that spacing is temporis alion, the dator and postponement by means of which intuition, perception, consummation in a word, the relationship to the present, the reference to a present reality, to a being are always deferred. Deferred by virtue of the very principle of difference which holds that an element functions and signifies, takes on or conveys meaning, only by referring to another past or future element in an economy of traces. This economic aspect of difference, which brings into play a certain not conscious calculation in a field of forces, is inseparable from the more narrowly semiotic aspect of difference. It confirms that the subject, and first of all the conscious and speaking subject, depends upon the system of differences and the movement of difference, that the subject is not present, nor above all present to itself before difference, that the subject is constituted only in being divided from itself, in becoming space, in temporizing, in deferral, and it confirms that, as Saussure said, language, which consists only of differences, is not a function of the speaking subject. At the point at which the concept of difference, and the chain attached to it, intervenes, all the conceptual oppositions of metaphysics, signifier /signified, sensible /intelligible, writing /speech, passivity /activity, etc. To the extent that they ultimately refer to the presence of something present, for example, in the form of the identity of the subject who is present for all his operations, present beneath every accident or event, self-present in its living speech in its enunciations, in the present objects and acts of its language, etc. Become impertinent. They all amount, at one moment or another, to a subordination of the movement of difference in favor of the presence of a value or a meaning supposedly antecedent to difference, more original than it, exceeding and governing it in the last analysis. This is still the presence of what we called above the transcendental signified. Kristeva, it is said that the concept of meaning in semiotics is markedly different from the phenomenological concept of meaning. In what ways, however, are they complicit, and to what extent does the semiological project remain intrametaphysical? Derrida, it is true that at first the phenomenological extension of the concept of meaning appears much wider, much less determined. All experience is the experience of meaning, shin. Everything that appears to consciousness, everything that is for consciousness in general, is meaning. Meaning is the phenomenality of the phenomenon. In the logical researches Husserl rejected Frege distinction between shin and Bedeutung. Later this distinction seemed useful to him, not that he understood it as did Frege, but in order to mark the dividing line between meaning in its most general extension, shin, and meaning as an object of logical or linguistic enunciation, meaning as signification, Bedeutung. It is at this point that the complicity to which you allude may appear. Thus, for example, one Husserl, in order to isolate meaning, shin or Bedeutung, from enunciation or from the intention of signification, Bedeutung's intention, that animates enunciation needs to distinguish rigorously between the signifying, sensible, aspect, whose originality he recognizes, but which he excludes from his logico-grammatical problematic, and the aspect of signified meaning, which is intelligible, ideal, spiritual. Perhaps we had best cite a passage from Ideas here. Let us start from the familiar distinction between the sensory, the so to speak bodily aspect of expression, and its non-sensory mental aspect. There is no need for us to enter more closely into the discussion of the first aspect, nor upon the way of uniting the two aspects, though we dearly have title headings here indicated for phenomenological problems that are not unimportant. We restrict our glance exclusively to meaning, Bedeutung, and meaning something, Bedeuten. Originally these words relate only to the sphere of speech, sprachliche Sphäre, that of expression, des Ausdruckens. But it is almost inevitable, and at the same time an important step for Nold. To extend the meaning of these words, and to modify them suitably so that they may be applied in a certain way to the whole noetico-noematic sphere, to all acts, therefore whether these are interwoven, verflochten, with exp, eschen acts or not. With th~s in view colony ourselves, when referring to any intentional exponent 7s, have spoken all along of shin, sens tilde, a word tilde which is generally used as an equivalent for b~2 meaning. We propose in the int.sts of d1 distinctness to favor the word Bedeutung, meaning at the conceptual level, when referring to the old concept a tilde d more particularly in the complex speech for tilde logical or expressing meaning. We use the word shin.se or meaning simpliciter, in the few tilde re, as before, in 1ts more embracing breadth of applications. Thus whether or not it is signified or expressed, whether or not it is interwoven with the process of signification, meaning is an intelligible or spiritual ideality which eventually can be united to the sense 1ble aspect of a signifier that in itself it does not it tilde presence, meaning, or essence of meaning, one is conceivable outside this interweaving as soon as the phenomenologist, like the semiotician, allegedly ref tilde s to a pure unity, a rigorously identifiable aspect of meaning or of the signified, to. This layer of pure meaning, or a pure signified, refers, explicitly in Husserl and at least implicitly in semiotic practice, to a layer of prelinguistic or pre-semiotic, pre-pressive, Husserl calls it, meaning whose presence would be conceivable outside and before the work of difference, outside and before the process or system of signification. The latter would only breathe tilde gm tilde and tilde into light, translate it, transport it, commune tilde cat tilde 1 t dot incarnate it, express it, etc. Such a meaning wh1ch in either case is phenomenological meaning, and, in the last analysis, that which originally is given to consciousness in perceptive intuition would not be, from the outset, in the position of a signifier, would hot be inscribed in the relational and differential tissue which would make of it, from the outset, a referral, a trace, a gram, a spacing. It could be shown that metaphysics has always consisted in attempting to uproot the presence of meaning, in whatever guise, from difference, and every time that a region or layer of pure meaning or a pure signified is allegedly rigorously delineated or isolated this gesture is repeated. And how could semiotics, as such, simply dispense with any recourse to the identity of the signified? The relationship between meaning and sign, or between the signified and the signifier, then becomes one of exteriority, or better, as in Husserl, the latter becomes the exteriorization, Äußerung, or the expression, Ausdruck, of the former. Language is determined as expression, the expulsion of the intimacy of an insight, and we return to all the difficulties and presuppositions we were just speaking of concerning Saussure. I have attempted to indicate elsewhere the consequences that link all of phenomenology to this privilege of expression, to the exclusion of indication from the sphere of pure language, of the logicity of language, and to the privilege necessarily accorded to the voice, etc. This privilege was already at work in the logical researches, in the remarkable project of a purely logical grammar that is more important and more rigorous than all the projects of a general reasoned grammar of 17th and 18th century France, projects that certain modern linguists refer to, however. Kristeva, if language is always expression and if its closure is thereby demonstrated, to what extent, and by means of what kind of practice, could this expressivity be surpassed? To what extent would non-expressivity signify? Would not grammatology be a non-expressive semiology based on logical mathematical notation rather than on linguistic notation? Derrida, I am tempted to respond in an apparently contradictory way. On the one hand, expressivism is never simply surpassable, because it is impossible to reduce c tilde the couple outside / inside as a simple structure of opposition. This couple is an effect of difference, as is the effect of language that impels language to represent itself as expressive representation, a translation on the outside of what was constituted inside. The representation of language as expression is not an accidental prejudice, but rather a kind of structural lure, what Kant would have called a transcendental illusion. The latter is modified according to the language, the era, the culture. Doubtful tilde s Western metaphysics constitutes a powerful systematization of this illusion, but I believe that it would be an imprudent overstatement to assert that Western metaphysics alone does so. On the other hand, a tilde inversely, I would say that if expressivism is not simply and once and for all surpassable, expressivity is in fact always already surpassed, whether one wishes it or not, whether one knows it or not. In the extent to which what is called meaning, to be expressed, is already, and thoroughly, constituted by a tissue of differences, in the extent to which there is already a text, a network of textual referrals to other texts, a textual transformation in which each allegedly simple term is marked by the trace of another term, the presumed interiority of meaning is already worked upon by its own exteriority. It is always already carried outside itself. It already differs from itself, before any act of expression. And only on this condition can it constitute a syntagm or text. Only on this condition can it signify. From this point of view, perhaps, we would not have to ask to wh tilde t tilde extent n tilde expressivity could signify. Only non-expressivity can signify, because in all rigor there is no signification unless there is synthesis, syntagm, difference, and text. And the notion of text, conceived with all its implications, is incompatible with the unequivocal notion of expression. Of course, when one says that only the text signifies, one already has transformed the values of signifying and sign. For if one understands the sign in its most severe classical closure, one would have to say the opposite: signification is expression, the text, which expresses nothing, is insignificant, etc. Grammatology, as the science of textuality, then would be a non-expressive semiology only on the condition of transforming the concept of sign and of uprooting it from its congenital expressivism. The last part of your question is even more difficult. It is clear that the reticence, that is, the resistance to logical mathematical notation has always been the signature of logocentrism and phonologism in the event to which they have dominated metaphysics and the classical semiological and linguistic projects. The critique of non-phonetic mathematical writing, for example, Leibniz's characteristic, in Rousseau, Hegel, etc., recurs in an unfortuitous manner in Saussure, for whom it coincides with a stated preference for natural languages, see cause, p. 57. A grammatology that would break with this system of presuppositions, then, must in effect liberate the mathematization of language, and must also declare that the practice of science in fact has never ceased to protest the imperialism of the logos, for example by calling upon, from all time, and more, non-phonetic writing as everything that has always linked logos to phone has been limited by mathematics, whose progress is in absolute solidarity with the practice of a non-phonetic inscription. About these grammatological principles and tasks there is no possible doubt, I believe. But the extension of mathematical notation, and in general the formalization of writing, must be very slow and very prudent, at least if one wishes it to take over effectively the domains from which it has been excluded so far. It seems to me that critical work on natural languages by means of natural languages, an entire internal transformation of classical notation, a systematic practice of exchanges between natural languages and writing should prepare and accompany such a formalization. An infinite task, for it always will be impossible, and for essential reasons, to reduce absolutely the natural languages and non-mathematical notation. We must also be wary of the naive side of formalism and mathematism, one of whose secondary functions in metaphysics, let us not forget, has been to complete and confirm the logocentric theology which they otherwise could contest. Thus in Leibniz the project of a universal, mathematical, MD non-phonetic characteristic is inseparable from a metaphysics of the simple, and hence from the existence of divine understanding 6 the divine logos. The effective progress of mathematical notation thus goes along with the deconstruction of metaphysics, with the profound renewal of mathematics itself, and the concept of science for which mathematics has always been the model. Kristeva, the putting into question of the sign being a putting into question of scientificity, to what extent is or is not grammatology a science? Do you consider certain semiotic works close to the grammatological project, and if so, which ones? Derrida, grammatology must deconstruct everything that ties the concept and norms of scientificity to ontotheology, logocentrism, phonologism. This is an immense and interminable work that must ceaselessly avoid letting the transgression of the classical project of science fall back into a prescientific empiricism. This supposes a kind of double register in grammatological practice. It must simultaneously go beyond metaphysical positivism and scientism, and accentuate whatever in the effective work of science contributes to freeing it of the metaphysical bonds that have borne on its definition and its movement since its beginnings. Grammatology must pursue and consolidate whatever, in scientific practice, has always already begun to exceed the logocentric closure. This is why there is no simple answer to the question of whether grammatology is a science. In a word, I would say that it inscribes and delimits science. It must freely and rigorously make the norms of science function in its own writing. Once again, it marks and at the same time loosens the limit which closes classical scientificity. For the same reason, there is no scientific semiotic work that does not serve grammatology. And it will always be possible to turn against the metaphysical presuppositions of a semiotic discourse the grammatological motifs which science produces in semiotics. It is on the basis of the formalist and differential motif present in Saussure's cause that the psychologism, phonologism and exclusion of writing that are no less present in it can be criticized. Similarly, in Jelmsov's glossomatics, if one drew all the consequences of the critique of Saussure's psychologism, the neutralization of expressive substances and therefore of phonologism, the structuralism, immanentism, the critique of metaphysics, the thematics of play, etc., then one would be able to exclude an entire metaphysical conceptuality that is naively utilized, the couple expression / content in the tradition of the couple signifier / signified, the opposition form / substance. Applied to each of the two preceding terms, the empirical principle, etc. 7. One can say a priori that in every proposition or in every system of semiotic research, and you could cite the most current examples better than in metaphysical presuppositions coexist with critical motifs. And this by the simple fact that up to a certain point they inhabit the same language. Doubtless, grammatology is less another science, a new discipline charged with a new content or new domain, than the vigilant practice of this textual division.